There you go. So yeah, this is a kind of prefacing for the introduction. I mean, I remember I sent you this this quote because I'm always quite amazed when I'm reading up various things, the way that Alice keeps cropping up. And even this weekend, we had a 3-page spread in the Financial Times about the up and coming V&A exhibition. But so on this is a quote. I mean, a quote from a technology guru-ish type person, and a quote: "Yeah, the best book on programming for the layman is Alice in Wonderland because it's the best book on anything, you know, for the layman." And it's quite true that a lot of the people who've used the Alice in Wonderland stories, you know, have varied. Actually, he got the ACM's Turing Award, but actually Alan Turing himself, I don't know whether you know this, he was also a fan of Alice. And I went up to Bletchley Park a while ago, and during the Second World War, when they were doing the breaking the codes, they actually put on their own parody of Alice in Wonderland and created books as well, because it was a book that appealed to them. And it does seem to appeal to across art, mathematics, technology, which is why things like games, you know, are so interesting to me. So this is from your, a little bit of a summary of yourself, but I'll give you some time to describe the other things you're doing as well. I summarized it, but I also put at the bottom some of the other things that you've done as well, because you're not just a games designer, although you're very well known for that. I mean, there's an example of the plush toy, the T-shirts, and the mugs as well. They're all part of your kind of 3D experience rather than 2D. Do you want to, you know, talk a bit about, you know, how you got into it, you know, and then also why Alice is such a muse for you?
Sure. Well, just on your point about Alan Turing and the attraction that Lewis Carroll's work has to people who might be in tech or in programming. I'm just now in the middle of a book called The Information by an author called James Gleek. And he actually goes into quite a bit of detail about the relationship between Charles Babbage and Lewis Carroll and a whole host of people who were very interested in cryptography and puzzles and logic and algorithms and sort of unraveling the nature of the relationship between language and mathematics, you know, sort of, and music, right? Sort of the Gödel, Escher, Bach trifecta. So they actually go into quite a lot of detail about that. They mentioned the Alan Turing connection, but I think it's because Lewis Carroll himself was such a fan of puzzles, math, you know, riddles, the connection between all of these things, and he wove that into the books, of course. So it stands to reason that even as the books seem to have aged, things like logic are eternal, and puzzles that are based on those types of things are eternal, and so they will always have an eternal attraction to people who understand or are driven or attracted to those types of things. So it was also one of the things that attracted me to it early on. As far as the biography goes, yeah, as you had on the slide there, I actually got my start back a very long time ago at a company called id Software, which they were sort of the vanguards in the space of turning games into 3D action games. And so I worked on things like Doom and Quake, but one of the things that drew me to Alice after that experience was that those games are, if you've played them, they tend to be quite industrial. There's no story to them. They're very fast-paced. There's a lot of violence in them. And working in that company, one of the things that I ran into very often was this sense that games and game engines didn't require story, and that violence could be the end-all be-all of what was happening in them. But I started to have a sense, along with a lot of other people, that things like puzzles and story mattered, and would be important as an art form, but that you'd have to bring something by way of story and art to the medium. So that was partly where the idea for Alice came from, was just a desire to move as much as possible away from things like the shotgun, the Martian, space base, the Space Marine of Doom and Quake, and into a more fantastical, magical, story-driven type of design. So yeah, and then as you have it here, the company that I run these days with my wife is called Mysterious. We're based here in Shanghai, and yeah, we do games, game design. We do everything from like card and board games, and then also art and other kinds of collectibles like the plush toys and the clothing and the jewelry and all kinds of fun stuff.
Yeah, I saw. I mean, I think the only thing that I saw you didn't do yet is perfume. So that'll be.
Well, my wife is currently working on a makeup set. It's pretty cool. So yeah, this is one of the kind of interesting advantages to being in China. Of course, these days there's a bit of controversy around it, but there is the ability to basically make anything here. So if you have an idea, if you're a creative type and you want to make stuff, this is obviously a really good place to do it. And so we've leveraged that with a lot of the stuff that you see here.
Okay. So going back to, so was the idea of Alice there? I mean, was it the link with the puzzles, the games that pulled you into using that as? I mean, if I use the wrong words, I apologize. As almost like as a vehicle or a framework for the 3D games.
Well, if people have heard this story before, I apologize. I've told it a number of times about why did I choose Alice initially. At the time, I was in California and I was working at Electronic Arts, and I was given an offer that you don't often get in the games industry, and that was carte blanche to go and make a game. Come up with an idea and make a game. And it was as shocking to me then as it is, I think, rare in general, even to this day. But so I spent some time trying to kind of reach around and think of, ideas that would be ways to push the medium. I didn't want to just make another shooter, because that's what at that time I was known for. Which by the way is a bit ironic, because now I'm known for Alice and I'm sort of stuck there. All of my efforts to get away from Alice never seem to get enough momentum to get me very far. So I'm always coming back to her. But yeah, I thought a lot about public domain properties, and I thought about whether or not it made sense to try to invent something completely whole cloth and new. And part of the challenge there was to present something to the corporate masters that they would understand and that they would believe was marketable. And to them, marketability is much more important than probably any other aspect of why they would approve something. So for Alice, at the time, I was able to state, and I think it's still the case, that it's probably one of the best known properties on the planet. Whether it's a public domain property or it's just something owned by sort of a big corporation. So that, of course, would be attractive to a big corporation like, say, Disney or Electronic Arts. The fact that so many people instantly recognize the character and the setup goes a long ways towards reducing their fear about people not knowing what it is that you're trying to sell. So yeah, that kind of brought me towards her. And then as I began to explore it, what I discovered opened up very nicely was the fact that as a game character and as a game universe, there's so much possibility. And it's not because there are no constraints. There are really good constraints, but they allow a lot of creative expression. And also that she, as a character, of course, we had to sort of veer her off the road a bit from the traditional story, but still the background of who she is as a girl who leads into the character that we have in the games is a foundation that I think is enviable for any character that you might write, whether it be for literature or film or television. She's got a lot of great setup to her. So that was another sort of mark in her favor. And at the time we got some artists involved in kind of sketching out early concepts around a couple of different stories. And it was just obvious that what was coming back for the exploration of the art for Alice, it just worked. We just knew it as we saw it, and as we showed it to people, it just worked. So I like to say that at that time, she really kind of came alive on her own. She took on a life of her own, and she very much, almost immediately as we began working, I felt that she acquired a voice of her own. It was very clear. It felt very natural to take her story in this direction. And so that kind of cemented it all. It all kind of came together in that fashion, story, art, character, and that opportunity. And yeah, here we are today.
How many people work on the games with you when you're, because it's quite an undertaking, with the amount of graphics, illustration, variation, storyline.
Yeah, and over the years, it's grown. The size of the teams has grown. So back when I was working on Doom and Quake, I was the 8th employee hired by id Software. And at that time, by the way, that included the receptionist at the time. So I was the 7th development person that was working inside of that company. And at that time in game development history, a team that size could turn out a game in about a year or a year and a half that would be the level of quality and the breadth of content of something like a Doom or a Doom 2. And a game like that could then go on to make, somewhere between $5 and $50 million or something like that. You fast forward to the most recent Alice game, Alice Madness Returns, we made that here in Shanghai, and our core team inside the Shanghai office was 80 people. And then we employed another 300 artists to work on that project. So just the budget of that game eclipsed what the games of the earlier era might have made in terms of total budget. I mean, in terms of total revenue. And so, of course, the budgets grew, the teams grew, and then the potential for success with them grew as well. But they become, and they have become, and they continue to grow in scale and scope and team sizes. It gets to be pretty crazy.
Okay, I'll move on to the next one because it's quite funny that even in the Alice stories through the Looking Glass, Lewis Carroll himself has got the idea of, if you like, gamification, which I'm sure you know as well. And he's captured the idea of life as a series of chess moves. And in the very first part of the book, he actually has the chess moves marked down, so you can move them on a chessboard, even though they wouldn't actually be very sensible. And they're the same moves that Alice makes during the book. So
I think. Yeah, go ahead.
If he was alive, so a little bit of me thinks that if he was alive today, that he would be interested in making Alice into a game rather than a book.
Yeah, well, I think if he were alive today, his head might explode from all the things that we've accomplished with game theory and mathematics and information theory in the time since. Again, this goes back to that close connection that he had with a whole group of people at that time who were trying to basically create a method for mapping out reality. That's, back in the time where he was writing the books, our grasp of the understanding of the mathematics of even just everyday life was still pretty rudimentary. And things like information theory and the binary language that we used eventually to code computers and make games, there was no sense of that yet. And so they were, all of them, puzzling their way through it and coming up with philosophies or algorithms for the dissection and recreation of the things that we take for granted in the world these days. So I think that was a very kind of scientific impulse that he had, sort of exploration of the unknown, and the way that he went about it was very artistic. It was very playful, but in that time, that sort of playfulness, I think, was a prerequisite, because so much of what was being done kind of felt like nonsense. the concept of analog computers versus digital computers, where the output is not always the same. It could vary depending on the temperature in the room, or if like literal bugs crawled into the works, right?
Yeah, and his background, and he was also an inventor. He made his flying mechanical bat, for example. There's a story that he went around to Charles Babbage's house to buy a calculating machine.
Yep.
But I don't think it was for sale. They got a demo of it, and then I think I read somewhere else that when Edison was, and he must have been in the UK, demonstrating his recording device, Carroll was just interested in lots of technology stuff, and he was creating his own inventions as well. I mean, like the Alice books.
Yeah, I can imagine, given that curiosity and his skill set, he probably would have been a fantastic video game designer.
Yeah. So one of the other themes is, from both of the games, I've just put up this slide here, and it's two different plays, but it's quite interesting that a number of people, including yourself, have sort of identified Alice and I'll put it like mental distress as well, and dealing with it. I didn't actually see the one on the left, Alice in the Cuckoo's Nest. This was, the wordplay is obviously one flew over the cuckoo's nest, and it was done in a number of libraries around the UK. But I have seen a performance of Laura Wade's Alice, where the Alice in that case is dealing with the loss of her brother and kind of goes into a strange world where, because she doesn't want to deal with what's going on. And it's quite interesting in your, in your games that you've picked up, on the same theme. Was there have you seen any of these, or is it?
No, actually, as a rule, I try to avoid watching or hearing or viewing anything that is another interpretation of the Alice stories, including the Disney films. And it's for a variety of reasons. I kind of want to keep my head clear of the potential influence, but also the fear of creating something that might step on the toes of something else that someone else has created, because that can be a real blocker, that you're sat there thinking, right, she's going to turn, she's going to go and do this next action or run into this sort of obstacle. But if you've gone through and consumed all of the content that's been created inside the Alice universe, and that's a lot, you will, at least for me as a writer, I would naturally then say to myself, I can't do that. That's been done before. And I don't want to have that problem. And so I make it a rule not to consume any other Alice content, just the books, and that's it.
Gosh, it's quite the purist.
Yeah, well, it's my way of avoiding writer's block, so it's really important to me. As far as the mental health angle on the story that I wrote, so I'm not sure who said it, but I've read it. I think a couple of different authors have said it, something along the lines of the story that you tend to tell when you write is oftentimes your own story, or in other words, we tend to tell our own story over and over again in a number of different ways. So the distress, the dealing with distress through the mental landscape, all of that derives from my own personal story, my personal background as a child. And I think, unfortunately, my Wikipedia page has, it outlines some of that, even though I didn't give permission for it to be there, but too late, it's there. So I drew on the experience of my childhood and the ways in which I tried to deal with that, either personally or through therapy, things like that. And then I poured that into the story and her story.
It was one of Lewis Carroll's uncle, I think, maybe it's Lutwidge Dodgson. He was a commissioner of lunacy in London. So Carroll himself would have gone to the old style lunatic asylums and seen, people there and the behaviours. And there was someone who did a presentation And he was explaining that like the Mad Hatter's Tea Party was actually the sort of thing they did to acclimatize you before you were, before you were released back into the community. So we would have seen some of those challenging behaviors.
Yeah, I think that she, as a character, provides a really unique vehicle for that exploration of the interior landscape of our minds. And I think it's one that people recognize. You don't have to do much setup, again, because of the way that Alice and her story have become so pervasive in the culture, and not just in Western culture, but around the world. The idea of going down the rabbit hole, and this notion that where Alice goes is a sort of fictional place within her own mind, and that these characters exist, as a function of her and her personality. So it's a natural vehicle for exploration of these types of themes. And I think that for me personally, the view was, I think still is my view, is that games also offer that sort of interactive exploration of difficult themes, but oftentimes game developers and game publishers tend to shy away from these themes because they are difficult to deal with. We don't necessarily want to watch depressing movies or depressing television shows. We don't want to play depressing video games. So I think the challenge is to find a way to wrap the difficult topics and the exploration of them in compelling locations, compelling characters, and characters that you feel an affinity or an attachment or an association with, which again, in the way that the Alice character developed, we've been able to deal with some very difficult subject matter, but do it in a way that if you base the reaction of the people who've played it, who themselves struggle, they seem to be quite touched by or affected by the way that the story and those elements have been presented.
Like another, as an aside, was there was a famous actor-director. Have you heard of Anthony Nato?
I'm not sure I heard that. Pantony.
Yeah, he was a founder of like the Theatre of Cruelty, but at one point he had a nervous breakdown, and so his doctors in 1940 something decided it would be good for him to translate Through the Looking Glass from English to French, I think, and it didn't work out well because at the end of it, he started to believe that he had written the book and that Lewis Carroll had plagiarized him.
Wow. Yeah, well, that's a difficult thing to assign that sort of tasks to somebody who's in distress that way.
So I just... So I've got here a slide with actually one of your pieces of art, which I'll be honest, I think is fantastic. And I bought a print as well. Where obviously we've got Alice as the main character, and it's obviously a tribute to Van Gogh as well.
Yeah. Well, to be clear, this is not by my hand that these pieces are created. We do have a team of artists. Right now, the team consists of 8 people, and they are all over the world. We have one in Australia, one in Israel, one here in China. There's one in Canada. There's one in Italy. And so this one in particular was done by one of our artists here in China. Her name's Joey. And she had actually worked at my company, my studio here in Shanghai previously, Spicy Horse. And this, so she'd worked on Madness Returns, and then she also worked on this, which is a presentation we did for a concept called Alice Otherlands. And so the reason why I chose this was that the concept of Otherlands was that after Alice had completed the stories of the first and second game, the idea was that she had mastered the ability to travel into the other lands of other people, hence Otherlands. And I then went through the history of London at the time when Alice would have been, in the region. We could have had a sort of an excuse for her to have bumped into people And I found that people like Thomas Edison had come to visit London at that time, or Van Gogh had been in London at that time. And with Alice and Van Gogh, the age crossovers, they were quite similar, the actual Alice and the actual Van Gogh. And so we had a notion that Van Gogh may have even been in the same asylum as Alice, and he would have been a little bit older, but that there could have been some sort of interaction, and maybe even some sort of mentoring in the skill of surrealism of the mind. So anyway, this was Alice venturing into his wonderland.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot. I mean, it's also been Alice as a muse to other artists, I think, in a previous communication. You know, you've got people like Salvador Dali, for example, doing a whole bunch of work. And I think he did some work that never got released by Disney for an Alice movie as well.
Yep. Yeah, there's a bunch of that in a museum in Japan, in Hokkaido, I think. Not Hokkaido, Hakone. There's a big museum there that's got some of those pieces in it as well.
Yeah, and it's funny that you mentioned the surrealists as well, because one of the members who's probably on the call is an expert on Alice and the surrealists, and she was also a muse to the surrealists as well, as was Lewis Carroll.
Well, it stands to reason. There's a lot to explore there, and I think that if you're into, you know, sort of the nonsense of the mind and creativity, then there's going to always be an attraction.
So another question then, obviously you're in Shanghai, which isn't Japan, but the other art forms, how do you regard things like anime? And this is from the Japanese Alice in the Land of Heart. Have you seen that, or?
Well, like I said, I go out of my way to avoid it. What I can say about Alice and Japan, the Alice of the games I created, is that she's hugely popular there. When we went to release the second Alice and we did a press tour in Japan, the head of marketing there told me that the Alice game was selling like crazy. And I said, I didn't know that it had been released yet. And she said, no, the first Alice game, which at that point, you know, was sort of 10 years old. And then we did an art book of Alice Madness Returns, which initially was released in English. And after a week or so after the release, it was the number one best-selling foreign book on Amazon.jp, and it stayed like that for apparently for a month or 2 months until the publisher relented and decided to produce a Japanese language version of that art book, and that thing apparently sold like crazy as well. So she's got huge fans in Japan.
Yeah, we had we had the late Amanda Cannell, who spoke about Alice and Yayoi Kusama. And yeah, it is fascinating. And so these were two others as well. Obviously, if you're avoiding all the influences, these are other ways, if you like, that Alice has been reinterpreted, you know, in different media.
I'm aware of it, and it's funny how often people send me messages or emails and say, hey, have you seen this new interpretation? So I will admit that when the most recent Disney movies came out, the ones that had Johnny Depp in them, I did go to see that first one, and I went with my writing partner, RJ Berg, and we went to a theater in San Francisco and saw that first one, and both of us had to hold the other one down by the arm to not let us stand up and walk out. we were not fans of that at all. And so yeah, I think oftentimes when I have broken the rule and looked at other interpretations, I'm just not that interested. And that's not to say that I think we have the best or nothing like that. But in my mind, I've been working on this Alice that we've created for the games for so long, and that I have a hard time viewing or understanding or getting attached to the other interpretations. By the way, I like that Tom Petty song a lot. I was actually listening to that in the car today.
It is fantastic.
Yeah. I don't know if you've seen all the cosplay that gets done for our Alice video game, but if you go and you look on Facebook or Instagram, there are cosplayers around the world that are just phenomenal. They take the costume designs that we do, the dresses for Alice, and they recreate them, and the detail that they put into them is just fantastic. I mean, there's a proper artistry going on there.
Is that just for sort of, what would we call it, conferences and exhibitions, or is there I know there's a cosplay genre, if you like, but...
Well, they certainly go to the cosplay conventions, and they like to wear these, these costumes in those types of settings. But you also find that a lot of the people that do this, they do it sort of professionally. And that means that they go out and they do their own private photo shoots, and they use professional photographers and photo editors. Some of them have brands of their own as cosplayers, and they make a living being cosplayers. So they're not just playing Alice, they actually play a whole range of characters. And so it's an art form in and of itself, and it's a proper skill. I mean, when you see the dedication that some of these artists have, you start to understand it.
So I guess one of the other pieces, because one of my interests is in what the academics call remediation. The way that the Alice story has been taken, and like you've done, and been taken into a different media, altered. And so this last quote I've used before, and just wondering, how do you think that, I mean, in your case as well, how the Alice story and the visual storytelling method, will develop?
Well, I read this quote before we started, and I take a bit of exception with it, especially when you try to apply it to games or interactive medium without agency in the characters, or having a reason for them to be and a goal for them, right? So yes, you can be the Mad Hatter or you can be the Teapot. The problem is, what does the Teapot want, right? And so when you try to go back and forth between characters in interactive medium, it's really important you set them all up. So it's like, it's a good question to kind of think, how many games have ever been developed with a shifting perspective of the characters? There are a few, by the way, but that's a lot more work, and you do have to put a lot of thought into multi-perspective storytelling, because I think what you'll see, like, there's a lot of AR, VR demos out there, like virtual reality demos where you put the goggles on, where they don't put a lot of storytelling into them because they feel that, hey, this ought to stand on its own just because it's so cool. Look what you're in a virtual world. But the experiences aren't very sticky, and you don't stay in there for long, because once you've overcome the novelty of it, which I think at the time when this was, this quote was written in 1991, the idea of interactive medium was still very novel, in the sense that you didn't need story in order for it to capture people's attention, was still very much a thing. I remember a direct quote from our lead technologist at the time on Doom and Quake, John Carmack, said to us directly, we need story in our games as much as you might need story in a pornography, in a porn film, right? So, back then, I think that there wasn't the sense that you needed it and you could be anything. But in the time since, I think we've discovered that it's kind of boring to be the Teapot, and that you need to pick a central character. And as far as the evolution of this goes, I don't know that storytelling in itself has evolved very much since the beginning of storytelling, because you still have to have those basic motivations and drives. The story, sort of plot structures and twists and turns of Shakespeare still function today. And those things will still function, hundreds of years from now. I don't know that we've invented new narrative structures to pivot on, and new ways to, you know what I'm saying? So
Yeah.
I don't think games are going to be the thing that creates that.
Yeah, there needs, in this, you're right in that whatever you are, there needs to be some context or motivation to it. It's not in, I mean, and I think that going back to the time maybe this was written, was it the Second Life, the virtual world, you
Yep,
know, and
that would have been in that. I don't know if Second Life existed in '91, but there were virtual worlds that were coming online. I think the Ultima games, Ultima Online, things like that were springing up. Second Life maybe was starting to come into fruition at that time.
I can remember. I mean, the problem would be that you get into it, and then it's what do you do? You know, you're right. You know, what do you do then when you're in this virtual world? It's more interesting than what you're doing in the real one.
Well, I think over time, what we've seen is this sense that somehow the technology will present a new form of storytelling, but I don't really know that it has. And the same thing goes with the concept of gamification, that somehow gamifying a particular process will revolutionize the way that people learn languages. Well, no, it's still just a lot of work and practice to learn languages. It doesn't matter how much gamification you stick on top of language learning. It's still done. Yeah, it's still hard. It's still done by rote.
Yeah, it's very hard to get into that top 10 on the leaderboard on Duolingo if you want to.
Yeah, exactly.
On Sunday nights, you just want to get top 10.
Yeah.
So what currently are there Alice projects? I mean, that you're currently working on?
Yeah, well, we're working on the design and pre-production phase of a third Alice game, which would actually be a prequel, and that's called Alice Asylum. And that will actually go back to the period where, in our game space, Alice is 13 years old, and it's just after the event, the fire, in which her family died. And in this story, we're doing a lot of setting of foundation for what comes in the second two games, but we're also resolving the overall story. So we wrap it all up. We go back to go forward. I don't want to say anything more than that because there may be people who don't want the spoilers, but if you're interested, we do share tons of this on various social media platforms, Instagram, Facebook, and then we have a platform called Patreon, and that's what powers the team of artists that we have. And so we're producing illustrations and game design and writing, and of course props and things like the Cheshire Kitten plush that you showed earlier. So that work is being done, and we update once or twice a week with new content, and so people can be directly involved. And we're trying to engage something called crowd design, so it's not just me by myself sat there writing, but we're actually writing stuff, and then we're gathering feedback from the audience, and then we're writing stuff and we're gathering feedback. So that's been a lot of fun.
Okay, so I think that I've let me check and see if I'll stop the share. So I'll do that. See what if I can scroll back up. So I'll go through. So first one is from Brian Sibley. So I'll read it out. The universality of the Alice books is indisputable. But how do you view the character of Alice herself in the context of Dodgson's original writing, and what features of that original characterization have you kept as part of your portrayal?
So our Alice, to be clear, is the Alice in the books, in Carroll's books. She's not the Alice of the real world. And by the way, if anybody ever asks, that's why there's no crossover between her and Carroll, because Carroll wasn't in the Alice books either. And the things that I think we appreciate about her in the game space, are many of the same things that people love about her in the books, that she's precocious, she's curious, she's an explorer and an experimenter. She's willing to challenge whatever she finds sort of the status quo in Wonderland. She's a bit brash, and so all those things make for a good main character in the games, the same that they make for a good main character in the books. She's likable, she's fun, and she is, I think ultimately one of the things I like about her is she does tend to stand very well on her own. She doesn't need supporting characters around her. She is an individual explorer in her own space, and that works really well for our format.
Okay, Brian has got a second. Do you think that the Burton films, you saw the Burton film, so do you think that the Burton films were influenced by your Alice?
I hope not, because what I just said about what I like about Alice as a character was one of the biggest violations that I felt that took place in the films. And I shouldn't say films because I've never seen the second film. One of my biggest issues with the film, the first film, was the fact that the Alice in that film had no agency. So in other words, you watch this entire adventure and her trying to come to terms with a number of interesting challenges, whether it was her coming of age or of her in a relationship with her family. But in the end, when the manifestation of all of this was presented as the Jabberwock, someone says to her, take the blade, you don't have to do anything, it'll do all the work for you. Well, that's lame, you know, like that's like giving Luke Skywalker the magic lightsaber and saying, don't worry if you haven't figured it all out, it'll just work, you know. So I don't know, I wasn't a big fan, and there were a lot of other things I found unlikable, but we won't go too far into that.
I don't think you're the only person who had that view as well. You might be pushing an open door with that one.
Yeah, well, it's a shame too, because visually it was obviously visually beautiful. The score, the sound, the costumes, I mean, so much about it. The acting, there was so much potential there, but I feel it was ruined by a soft approach to what could have been a really good, hard story for her.
Okay. Francesca Colt has got a question about you're saying that one of the stories that shaped your own life was The Dark Crystal. And so there's been a remake about it's all about the interconnections of mind and nature. So have Alice and the Dark Crystal crossed over and over again in the 21st century? We try to make sense of our own worlds and ourselves.
Yeah, so first off, a warm hello to Francesca, because she and I have chatted in the past, so I know her quite well. So I'm glad she's here. Yeah, she's probably aware of the fact that there was an inspiration, a moment of inspiration when I was searching for what this game would be, the concept that I would deliver to EA when they asked me to come up with something. And it was, I didn't know at the moment, but it was a song. And in the song at the beginning, there was a sampling from a movie, and there's the mention of a time of wonder and the crystal cracked. And so I heard this, and I heard the word wonder, and that was what triggered me to, Wonderland. Right, what about an Alice in Wonderland game? Oh my God, and of course the song I was listening to also had a bit of a dark tone to it. So immediately my mind was flooded with a sort of darker twist on this. And then later on, I learned that sample came from lines in The Dark Crystal. I think it's the opening sequence of The Dark Crystal, actually, where they kind of do the exposition to set up the background of the narrative. So that was the thing that triggered it in my mind. And as far as the new series go, I haven't had a chance to watch it because we just had a baby boy, and that takes a lot of time.
So people don't know, I mean, and so by Dark Crystal, just in case people don't know, that's the Jim Henson, David Bowie film. That's how I always. So there's a question from Lindsay about, has there been much criticism about the amount of violence in the Alice stories?
It's a good question, and it's interesting because our sense of what is violent has shifted so much over time, right? So if we all went back and looked at Doom right now, we would view it as a pixely, blobby mess on the screen, and you'd have a very difficult time discerning the blood from the bricks on the wall, right? It's very, very, very low resolution. It's incredible how low resolution it is, and yet for some reason in the era of Doom, when we viewed it as being incredibly high fidelity, right? This was our mind filling in the blanks because we'd never seen high fidelity before. That's a whole nother topic of its own, by the way. Look, there's an article in Wired you should look up about a lumberjack in Canada who lost his sight, and then they put electrodes in, and he was able to see through a camera, but the density was only like 8 by 8, or so 64 pixels, but he was able to perceive the whole world around him through 64 pixels of these sensors. Anyway, back in the day, we thought Doom was hyper violent and it was rated M, but if you were to try to go and get that rated as a game now, it would probably be E for everyone. So not only has the technology moved away in such a fashion that like we don't even perceive Doom to be bloody anymore, but also our sense of what is violence in a game has shifted. So the first Alice was rated M, and I think it was the first game that EA ever published that was M. And at one point we had to change the box art because the retailers were complaining that she was stood on the cover of the box holding a bloody knife, and that was like, no, you can't have a knife on the cover. Now look at games, you know, GTA is the favorite sort of horse to beat on this topic, where you've got, you know, the characters on the cover of the box with guns, and you know, it screams violence, and the games that we produce these days are incredibly violent. So like when we produced Madness Returns, there was nothing in the game that at that point really warranted it being an M-rated game. EA was pushing us to make it more M-rated in fact. So the bar is constantly moving, and we're getting to a point now though where the technology can just, you know, you could render anything and it's be horribly graphic and violent. It's not of a particular interest to me, and for the Alice story that we tell, I've never tried to push the violence angle. In fact, when EA came and said make the game more M, don't look this up if you're easily offended, but I sent them a bit of art that was X-rated. And I said, you mean like this? And then they didn't ask me to put more of that type of content in the game. So I don't see, you know, that the games I make, there's enough violent games being made, and I don't feel that the games that I make and that Alice's story are necessarily the place where more violence is needed.
Okay, Katie Hume, who's one of your Patreon patrons, has got a question about the poetry in the Alice books, like The Hunting of the Snark. So have you considered incorporating this into the riddles and puzzles of Asylum, particularly regarding the stages of grief?
Hey, Katie, very nice to see you. I see you've got your Cheshire Kitten there. Yeah, you know, it's a good question. I think that one of the things that I've been toying with in the writing for the new game is the idea of it overall being much more of a puzzle narrative. Now, the problem is, again, I don't want there to be spoilers in this because I don't know how many people here would be bothered by that, but we have talked about it quite a bit. And actually that book that I'm listening to right now called The Information, because it's talking about signals and signal interpretation and compression and codes and cryptography, and how Lewis Carroll had an association with all of this in very early days. It got me thinking that in our narrative, I really want it to be that Alice is following this series of clues that almost come across as a sort of cryptographic adventure, you know. So to Katie's point, that could be in things like poems and in things like songs in the game. And then we also tend to put a lot of iconography. So we use the symbols of alchemy quite a lot, because there's alchemy symbols themselves have tons of meaning loaded into them. So we're going to use symbology like that as well. And through all of that, I'm hoping that the players will, they'll piece together the riddle of, you know, that's what the character of Alice is following. That's what piques her interest. That's why she's on this particular adventure, because these riddles start kind of showering down on her, and she's got to work her way through them.
Okay. Someone's corrected me that David, that was Labyrinth I was thinking of rather than the Dark Crystal.
Yeah, I think Dark Crystal is the one with the puppets. Labyrinth had puppets too, but it did not have David Bowie.
Okay, well, there are no other questions in the chat box. What I'll do is I'll open it up so that if people have got questions, I'll trust them all not to shout over each other.
That's a lot of trust.
Yeah, she knew them.
Can I just come back to you on the violence? Oh. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah. No. There was a second part to that question, but it wasn't really a question. It was simply saying there is criticism about violence in treatments of Alice, but there's so much subliminal and not so subliminal violence in the originals. We had a talk once on the Alice and violence, and it just sort of poured out. So I'm just saying, supporting you in a way, or supporting anyone, that it is there, and it's simply re-channeled for today, and that's all. It's not really a question, but it's just a point that it happens to be true.
One of the points that I often make when people want to criticize the violence, which is fair, it's fair to criticize, to be a critic of media, but is that everything that's happening in the games is happening inside of her mind. And so the idea is that if there is violence, it's her mind enacting violence on itself. She's struggling with issues and problems, and in the struggle, we see that manifested in the visuals, in the visuals as violence, between two characters. But one of the things that I like about the kind of violence we have in Wonderland is it's never violence against innocent humans, by running them over randomly on the street. It's never the portrayal of meaningless violence, because every action that Alice takes within the realm of Wonderland is an action that is furthering her movement towards her goals, and her goal is to be healthy and to get better, right? She's not in it for treasure, she's not in it for glory, and she's in it to heal herself.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm just trying to see who. Brian had a couple of questions. I wonder if he's got any more.
I was going to speak to Lindsay's point on the violence in the Alice games. If you even look at, the whole scene with the Duchess, and then the whole bit, and then even the Walrus and the Carpenter, which I believe references to that make an appearance in the second level of Madness Returns. It's it's subtle, like things that you pick up reading it a second time around when you're a little older, but it's not. There's been arguments made that initially it's not technically a children's book, as it were, but that's a whole other debate.
Yeah, well, the whole debate about violence in media is one that I always find quite interesting. Coming from the Doom era, we were sued by Jack Thompson. We were sued during the time of the Columbine massacre because there was this sense that Doom somehow played a role in the violence that was enacted in that incident. But every time that people talk about violence in games, I'm quick to point them back to, like, say, for instance, Titus Andronicus by Shakespeare, because that's probably one of the more violent literary creations that there ever is. And if you've never seen the Julie Taymor version of that on film, that's and so it's not like violence in media is something new. And I was raised in a Christian household, being read the Bible as a child, and I'm pretty sure I remember there was a lot of smiting going on in there, and so I don't know. I think that the idea that we shy away from it, but when it's nonsensical and it doesn't fit the purpose of the story, then sure, it's
even
something.
when you look at things like Laurel and Hardy and the Three Stooges, they weren't exactly hands off with each other.
Yeah, exactly.
I think one of the things that I found so interesting about Americans games, and hello Americans, nice to see you again. When we did this interview ages ago, I'm just holding up the Lewis Carroll review. You can find the interview online. I think I said to you how I thought you really hit the nail on the head in your interpretation of Alice, and you said, all of the violence is occurring in it. It's happening in the mind, and so it does in the own book, and the whole book's purpose is meant to be cathartic. It is a cathartic journey. Everything that's confronted within it is meant to be overcome. So the whole underground journey, borrowed from Greek mythology, of course, is meant to be cathartic. And Lewis Carroll himself writes in the appendix to the book, which is called An Easter Greeting, that this is meant to be healthy amusement. It's meant to be overcoming all of the things that are dark and difficult. And it's meant to help you to be a guide on this journey. So I think you really absolutely hit the nail on the head when you did the whole thing. And you said, you know, the point about mediation was really interesting because you found slightly different means for it. And I think Lewis Carroll gives a great approach for that, because what you've done is basically the same thing Lewis Carroll did, just by another medium.
There's an important concept that we're wrapping into the new story, and that is that without the confrontation, without a confrontation with chaos, there is no transformation. So in terms of it being our physical health, you know, as an example, exercise is a kind of chaos to our bodies, but without it, we are not healthy. And the same thing is true of us as individuals psychologically, that if we don't have challenging experiences, we don't grow. And in fact, we tend to become static, and, you know, being static is being dead, being in stasis, not moving, you know. So a healthy amount of chaos and a healthy amount of, if you want to call it violence, but, you know, challenge or obstacles is necessary for a healthy being. And that is a very big theme that's in the game, or the story that we're working on now.
I'm really looking forward to that.
When Katie mentioned the walrus and the carpenter a few moments ago, and in the light of what you've just said, it seems to me that's a very, very good example of Alice having to face conflict and a matter of choice and challenge of what is good and what is not good in her debate about which is the preferable character. Is the walrus better than the carpenter, or the carpenter better than the walrus? And, you know, that whole setup of the fairly violent behavior of the walrus and the carpenter towards the oysters becomes for Alice a complex idea about which kind of violence is preferable or better or more excusable than the other. So I think you're right. Those challenges are confronted by Alice again and again, as they are in the courtroom scene with the Duchess and so on. So I think you're absolutely correct in saying that challenge is part of what Lewis Carroll was setting up in the character.
It's a topic that's touched on in that book, again, that I'm reading now, the information, because in the exploration of logic, it tips over into philosophy, and in the philosophy of, it's sort of the train track dilemma, right? You know, do you pull the lever to run over the one guy in order to save 5 guys, or do you, right? Well, this is logic, and it's the kind of things that were being explored at that time by Carroll and by Babbage, and it made a lot of people very uncomfortable. They didn't want the universe broken down into logical elements that could result in the analysis of and decision to pull the lever. It seemed immoral. It seemed it wasn't natural, right? But it is the kind of thing that I think we're seeing more and more, and I don't want to go into politics, but we are seeing more and more these days that people are being taught that the idea of a binary outcome of A is better than B can't be talked about, you know, that everybody has to be given a prize, or that every answer is correct, or that every solution should be explored. That's not really the way the world works. So I think, again, that's one of the reasons why that topic is being explored in the story that we're writing now.
Is the book you're talking about American? Is it James Gleick, Gleick?
Correct.
Okay, I would have, yeah. I mean, I think he also wrote earlier books as well on, I think, on chaos.
That's correct. Yeah, the book before that was called Chaos, and he has a few others as well. He's a phenomenal author.
Yeah, and I mean, and going back to the cryptography, you know, and the puzzles as well. I mean, at the time that Carroll was writing all of that, I mean, he had a background in, you know, in just coming up with puzzles all the time. And now, I think one of my ideas was, if he was working today with all the cryptography that's required in communication, that, you know, that's another area of, you know, I mean, he would have been so happy with all the new tools that he would have been given.
Absolutely.
are there any questions from anybody else on the call? Because I know.
None that I can ask without risking spoilers.
No. Well, if there isn't, I mean, I'll, if it's okay with everyone, I mean, I've recorded it and I'll see if I can put it up on YouTube, because I've certainly, I mean, hopefully, I mean, everyone has learned a little bit more today, you know, about the work that American McGee has been doing. The Lewis Carroll Society is an unusual group, as an audience. And but I do appreciate the time that you've given us today, particularly as it's the end of your working day as well. And also,
Thank you very much.
and also, if you think that you need any information, feel free to use us as a resource as well.
Sure. I really appreciate the invite. It's very nice to speak with everybody and to have, I guess, the implicit blessing on the games finally. So if Lindsay wants to write a retraction letter to the to the earlier admonishment, that would be great. No, I really appreciate the invite, and I'm happy to talk to everybody. And you know, you're all of you welcome to check out what we're working on, and I'm always happy to hear feedback from everyone.